young civil rights activists tell their own story. The book is by Ella Levine, and it was published in 1992. 1992. And the story that you just mentioned, Mother, along with other young people. One of the things that made this fascinating was it's about young people. And I spent some time talking to the young man today and also tonight, and telling him how important it was that the movement really was about young people, whether it's in Mississippi or Alabama or Southwest Georgia or Louisiana for that matter. It's about young people. I was a young person also featured in this book. The book is about 25 or 30 young people, including Fred Sutherland, who was a colleague of Dr. King, was a young person. People don't think about that. Dr. King himself was a young person. But to your question, in terms of background, I was born in a place called Holly Springs, Mississippi, which is just south of Memphis, about 40 miles. And while I think the first thing they did need was in a till, I think I was 7 or 8 years old in a rural school at that time, a rural segregated school, slaughtered down in the Mississippi Delta. And my teacher, Henry Boyd, because at that time the Chicago Defender was not permissible in Mississippi, let me be soft with it. And so the train would come from Chicago to Memphis, pass through Holly Springs on the way to New Orleans. And the guys who worked on the train would throw the paper out the window, and Mr. Major Wilson and another would go and pick the paper up. And that was the first time we heard about the murder of Emmett Till. The next time, of course, was by my teacher, Mr. Boyd. And obviously, he was telling us about the shock. Not that this had occurred, but it occurred to a 14-year-old. I mean, people were aware of the fact that in Mississippi and a lot of other places, you kill people. But they usually were adults, but not 14-year-olds. So that made us big. I think I was, 7 or 8 at the time, so you could appreciate the trauma. Holly Springs was a little bit different from the Delta, for example. We call the Hill Country. Mississippi is divided into about 4 geographical areas: the Hill Country, the Delta, the coast, and the Pinewood part of the state. So we're in sort of northern, what I call the Hill Country part of Mississippi. My parents were fortunate in the sense that right after the Civil War in 1870, and I still have it indeed, my great-great-parents, the Thompson we call them, my great-grandmother was named Hannah Jane, my great-grandfather was named Lewis, and they bought about 300 or 400 acres of land. How they got it, I don't know. I'm still trying to research that. But they got it, and they passed it down. And I have some of the land today that was passed down from my great-grandmother to my grandmother to my great-aunt to my mother, and then I got it from my mother. So there was a kind of independence that we had, given that we were landowners as opposed to being sharecroppers. That's a difference in a place like Mississippi. The other thing that hit me as a youngster was in 1862, my brother Melvin and I stood on the square in Holly Springs, Mississippi, and watched 30,000 fellow troops. And we stood out there the whole time because we thought there was a war going on. And they were headed to Oxford, Mississippi to ensure the safety of James Meredith. They had entered the university. Now, Dennis mentioned earlier that Medgar Evers, along with others, had attempted to enroll at the University of Mississippi earlier and was rejected. And later on, the NAACP, instead of pursuing legal action, decided that this young man had so much talent and so much promise, they made him the executive director of the NAACP, and the rest, of course, is history. We in 1964, just to jump ahead for a moment, as high school kids working with Debbie Flynn out of New York, who was a playwright, wrote a play called Seeds of Freedom, because we sat around the campus of North College trying to figure out how we could be involved, what we could say. And so we wrote that play and put it on in Meridian, Mississippi, initially in Holly Springs and Meridian, and then we put it on at the Riverside Church in New York City. Back to that period, though, Frank Smith, an organizer there in Holly Springs, voter registration thing. And they had started, set up a Kofo house right there on the square of Memphis Street and West Avenue. And people like Thurman Lynn from Yale was there, Stephen Carmichael was on the scene, Cleveland Sellers was on the scene. And so as high school kids, you always have this curiosity. So we sort of drifted over there and sort of figured out what was going on. And by doing that, we were, how can I say, trapped for life. You know, it was something about the enthusiasm, it was something about what they had to offer, and some of the things they had to say that was important. But then it made another important point. The movement didn't start with people that came from the outside. Mr. S.T. Nero had been active in the 20s and 30s. There's another gentleman named Henry Reeves, who wrote a book about called Voices from the Mississippi Hill Country, had been actively during the 30s with the NAACP on the ground, because that's how you had to exist on the ground. So we didn't know a lot of things going on there. Adults didn't know to share a lot with us. But we felt, even as youngsters in high school, because I was pretty active in high school, there were things that the principal had done, even as a high schooler, that we didn't particularly like. So we ended up demonstrating against the principal, even as a high school. Now, what did that do? I found out later there's a spy agency in Mississippi at the time called the Sovereignty Commission. I didn't find out later that we were in that, had been spied on by this. Now imagine high school kids, right, going about their business, high school kids, being spied on by a state sovereignty agency. We found that out later. So that was sort of the early involvement. One of the things that we focused on for the Freedom Summer was the vote. And Dennis mentioned that the students had come down to work because there were people saying that black people didn't want to vote. And they sort of going to prove that a lot. There were folk where we would canvass, would go from house to house, including some of my teachers who were afraid to register because they knew what that entailed. If you tried to register to vote, they would be fired. The same thing applied to people that worked in somebody's home. If you tried to vote, you would be fired. Because they simply put your name in the newspaper. When you tried to register, your name went in the newspaper and you were fired. Just a little bit about the town, though. The town was sort of different from your typical Delta town again. It was sort of a middle-class town. It had two colleges, Rusk College and Mississippi Industrial College, right? I tell my friends in Boston, when I got to Boston, I had never seen a white doctor, because the doctor was black, the dentist was black, teacher was black, principal was black, church was black. So that's all you saw. The only time we saw white people was when we went to town square. And even there, the grocery store owner was a black person. And outside of town, the grocery store owner was a black person. So my experience in terms of Holland Springs sort of had this reputation for not being a vicious place. It was genteel, right? It was a merchant town. So it didn't want to give the reputation of being too violent. Even though I know violence took place, I did not witness any violence. There was instances as a high school kid when we integrated theater, because at the time, the theater was black people sat up top, and the white folks sat down bottom. And so we decided, as high school kids, we were going to stop that. We decided to go down and sit in the comfortable seats. And of course, the sheriff politely came over. And it's interesting to think about the sheriff. The sheriff considered himself a murderer. He didn't arrest us. He brought us out and told us that we should not do that. He was going to notify our parents, and that would be that. Now, what happened with that, though, is that the owner of the theater, Mr. Roundtree, decided to close the theater rather than desegregate the theater. But even as a youngster, we found out he didn't really close the theater. And we had a young lady who was one of my classmates, pretended to talk in a typical Southern white lady's voice. So she called to find out about how she could get tickets. And what they did was they turned the theater into a private club as a way to avoid desegregating the theater. So those are kind of little minor kind of things, but irritating kind of things that could bother you even as a teenager. So my involvement really was coming over seeing people involved and also participating in that whole process as a youngster. I think I was 14, maybe 15 at the time.